What is good, everybody? We are on the eve of the 2022 US Open. Before we get into this draw, I just wanted to clear some things up. Of course, the last time I was active was about 2 weeks ago at the back end of the Rogers Cup tournament in Canada, and a lot has happened since then. Of course, being a Cincinnati native, I was present for much of the tournament a week ago, and I must say, in spite of some unexpected results, it was one of my favorite years visiting the tournament yet this year. Got some flicks with some people that may someday do something in this sport, but nonetheless, of course, in the following week, this past week, I have been dealing with some internet issues. My internet's been down on campus back at school. But nonetheless, I needed to get this US Open preview out of the way. Obviously, a big headline prior to heading into this tournament is Novak Djokovic for the second time this year being unable to enter a Grand Slam tournament on account of his unvaccinated status. It's hard to really say much on this. I mean, I have been kind of pent up in my views about this particular subject since the beginning of the year, and hopefully I'm able to get off a video about his year at the end of the season and elaborate more on what I've thought from the beginning on this. But I will say that this was kind of expected. I mean, we can talk all day on whether a mandate on, unvaccinated non-citizens being outdated at this point or not. You very well may have a point on that, but the idea that was going to change on account of a tennis player playing the US Open or not, especially in the United States where there are other sports that take much greater precedence, that idea was always going to be kind of outlandish. Of course, any draw is better off with Novak Djokovic in it, but that is all just a product of the times right now, and it's also just a part of what Novak Djokovic accepted as one of the potential outcomes, having to forego these tournaments at the beginning of the year. So it just is what it is on that front. But anyway, with a lot of that housekeeping stuff out of the way, the draw. And straight off the bat, I'm just going to say that this, on paper, absolutely should be a very difficult US Open to predict. A lot of the guys that you would consider the topmost contenders at this point of the year are more vulnerable than they have been in the past, especially when compared to this point in time a year ago. Starting right up top with the first quarter with the Daniil Medvedev Quarter, this is one that's quite loaded. You have seeds of Medvedev, Kyrgios, and Bautista Agut there, as well as Carreño Busta, De Minaur, Khachanov, and Auger-Aliassime. Now for Daniil Medvedev and what will be his title defense from a year ago, I think it's a pretty routine shot to the second week and the fourth round. But from that point, you have the possibility of facing Nick Kyrgios, who recently upset him in Canada, as well as Roberto Bautista Agut. In general, Medvedev is a whole lot more vulnerable than he was a year ago. The confidence just hasn't been the same, in my opinion, since that Aussie Open final really this year. And to make matters worse, he's been dealing with a few issues with his serve. Really has not been potent as we're used to. Really save a couple of matches here and there. And in spite of starting hot during what has been his best part of the season with the North American hardcourt swing in Los Cabos this year, even compared to what was previously his worst North American hardcourt summer, this one definitely has overtaken that spot as he played a flat match against Nick Kyrgios to lose early in Canada, and then I think that quarterfinal match against Fritz in Cincinnati was encouraging, definitely his best serving and overall performance during this North American hardcourt swing. Yet, any momentum gained from that was shot to pieces in the semis against Tsitsipas, where he looked like a disaster through stretches of that match. especially on serve. So all of that goes to say this is the most vulnerable that Medvedev has been heading into the US Open since he became the Medvedev we know. And with potentially two troublesome matchups on the horizon in the round of 16 with Kyrgios or Bautista Agut on deck, I mean, honestly, even Ugo Humbert has given him trouble in the past, but I don't expect him making it that far. Daniil Medvedev is going to have to find form and find it quick. Now, considering in my last video how I said that I still don't know that I trust Nick Kyrgios best of 5, I'm still going to roll with that gut feeling and say he needs to show me yet again after Wimbledon, so I'll have Bautista Agut being the one to play Medvedev. For RBA on the hard courts this year seemed to be a story of a couple tough draws. Got Coric, eventual champion, in Cincinnati, and then Casper Ruud and him played a terrific match in Canada, coming just short in that one. I am definitely in two minds here because I am leaning, honestly, picking the upset for Daniil Medvedev at the hands of either Bautista Agut or PCB in the quarters. I know that RBA has the superior matchup advantage, a pretty commanding head-to-head lead over Medvedev, albeit in a 5-match sample size, but Carreño Busta is also in better form at the moment. I'll roll the die on that and say that Medvedev will make it to the quarters. The US Open has been a great hunting ground for Daniil, so I'll just pick him through on the quarters simply on the basis of familiarity around this court. Little bit of a spoiler there, but it really shouldn't be. Carreño Busta, 2-time semifinalist. I think he too will be meeting Daniil in the quarterfinals, especially given his draw. Obviously starts off with Dominic Thiem, but Thiem clearly not the same player that he was the last time he played and won this event. He's absolutely made strides this summer and has looked better at this point in the year than he did at any point before. But there's clearly some work to be done on his end. I think PCB clears that hurdle with little issue, and I think he too makes it to the round of 16, honestly, with little issue. Pablo is well rested. Of course, there are the floaters with Bublik second round and then potentially de Minaur in the third round. But from the action I saw in Canada, and I don't lump that Carreño Busta Masters win with some of the weaker ones you'd consider in the past. If you actually watched his matches, he was playing at an unbelievable level, had the tough task of taking on Kekmanovic in Cincinnati on a very quick turnaround after winning that title. He should be well rested now, and I think as a result he'll have little trouble making it to the second week. He could face Felix Auger-Aliassime, next highest seed. They're defending semifinals points from last year, and it really has been a weird streak for Felix ever since that RG quarterfinal where he took Rafa to 5 sets. Early exit in Wimbledon, consistent enough results after that, but never really the level again, or at least very rarely the level again that he showed in the first half of the year. And honestly, he looks a little bit rocky right now. Could get Ruusuvuori second round, Kachanov third round. Those are both guys that I wouldn't be surprised if he stumbled against, and honestly, I expect him to struggle against, even if he's able to win both of those. Nonetheless, he's been consistent enough to make quarters pretty frequently, even in this stretch post-RG, and he's gotten wins over the likes of Norrie and Sinner, so hesitantly, I'm going to pick him to make it to the 4th round, but I do like Carreño Busta there. And as I said earlier, I really am leaning Daniil Medvedev going out before the semifinals, but I really don't know that I can bring myself to do that. Daniil Medvedev has just been so good at this event, going back the past 3 years pretty much, and that pedigree still means something to me, and I still think that his form, even though not anywhere near his best right now, I think it still can be good enough to take out PCB. But obviously, Pablo on the heater that he is right now, it's going to be a very tough out. But I'm still going to go with Medvedev, probably in a battle, but, if nothing else, simply off of his history here. Moving on to the second quarter with Stefanos Tsitsipas Quarter. It features seeds, of course, Steph, Cressy, Cerundolo, Berrettini, Fritz, Van de Zonschulp, Tommy Paul, and Casper Ruud to round things out. Starting with Tsitsipas, a lot of people have pointed out that this year, to his credit, he's still been putting up excellent results. Aside from the French Open, you could argue that he's been more consistent this year than he was last year. And for the most part, it's honestly felt like he's done that without his best level, aside from it flashing in a couple matches like the Sinner one in Australia at the beginning of the year. And I don't even know. I would be hard-pressed to name another against an elite opponent. Maybe Zverev in Monte Carlo. But that being said, level-wise in Cincinnati, the last tournament Steph played before this US Open, this was arguably his best event as far as level went throughout the entirety of a tournament. Of course, the signature win coming against Daniil Medvedev, a guy who has had his way with him, although not as much as you would think recently. But Steph, of course, able to pull out a tight win on a quick hard court that you would think favored Medvedev. And then, in spite of, I think, disappointing in the final after he was up a break, there really wasn't as much pushback as you would have expected from Tsitsipas, but still he's going into the US Open with quite a bit of good momentum. Don't really see anyone that problematic aside from Cressy pre-fourth round for Tsitsipas. Of course, if you struggle returning, Cressy can make things tricky, and that is certainly the case for Steph, but I did get to see him play Isner in Cincinnati, and I think that was honestly one of John's better serving matches this year. He was really bringing the heat, and Steph's concentration level was consistent enough to really outlast Isner in that one. If he plays as he's been, I expect the same kind of thing to happen there. I think he'll be on a collision course with Matteo Berrettini for a quarterfinal spot in the round of 16. Berrettini, obviously another guy who had some tough draws this year on the North American hard courts. Red hot PCB in Montreal, and then tight third set tiebreak loss to Tiafoe in Cincinnati, who was playing inspired tennis in that match. And you look at this draw, and really even the next highest seed with Cerundolo, or even any floaters like Murray or John Millman or something. I think on a quick US Open hard court like it's become lately, Berrettini's serve and forehand will do the trick to get him to that round of 16 clash with Tsitsipas. In spite of Matteo's struggles this summer, both with health and really getting any matches under his belt, he is a jarringly better player in best of 5 than he is best of 3. Add on that I think Matteo Berrettini has had a track record of coming back from these injury breaks, not really needing many matches to get himself going, and I do like him over Tsitsipas to make the quarters again. When he's been at majors healthy, he has been pretty much a lock to make at least quarterfinals. He's been consistent across all surfaces. And Steph is still kind of unproven at the US Open. I don't think he's ever gone past the third or fourth round. And then as for who I think his quarterfinal opponent will be, you have Taylor Fritz and you have Casper Ruud on the other portion of the section. Taylor Fritz has been pretty much a top 10 level player all year this season, and it's continued this summer on the hard courts. You add on that his draw really isn't all that taxing. Bodek van de Zonschulp is who he could play third round, and I honestly just feel like Taylor would outclass just about anybody he could face pre-quarterfinals. His draw is very nice. On the other hand, I wouldn't be surprised if Casper Ruud goes out early. I'm circling that potential Tommy Paul or Sebastian Korda third round that he might get. Although Casper has had some nice results here and there on the North American hard courts, I remember Cincy last year and then Canada this year. I still think there is a learning curve there, and big picture, Taylor Fritz a big favorite in my eyes to come out and make the quarterfinals for a second straight major here. And honestly, in that quarterfinals where I think the form advantage really will show, I think Taylor Fritz is absolutely playing better than Berrettini at the moment. A lot of the stuff that I think favors Matteo against Tsitsipas, I just think wouldn't be able to be exploited against Taylor Fritz in the form that he's in right now. And yeah, I would definitely lean him making the semifinals out of this section. And now at the halfway point, we get the Carlos Alcaraz Quarter. This quarter, of course, featuring seeds Alcaraz, Coric, Evans, Cilic, Sinner, Dimitrov, Musetti, and Hurkacz. So of course this summer has really brought about the Alcaraz-Sinner rivalry to the forefront of the game, and after a couple of struggle fests over the years between the next gen and their matches, it's been a very refreshing and enjoyable one, and they are on a collision course to meet in the quarterfinals here. But albeit the second halves of their years have seen them going in different directions, albeit in my opinion not really that severe. But let's start with Alcaraz. If you ask me, I think the first real danger match for Carlos here is Borna Coric in a potential third round match. Borna, of course, an unbelievable story coming off of the title in Cincinnati pretty much at the beginning of his comeback, coming back from pretty much a year-long shoulder injury from last year. And the thing with Carlos, as I have addressed in a prior video, is obviously he's come down from the purple patch that he was on at the beginning of this season, and there's a lot that's going into that. I think the three biggest being he's not returning on par at all with what he was at the beginning of the season. At least that's what it looks like to the naked eye, missing a lot of very makeable returns. And secondly, as he admitted after the Tommy Paul match in Canada, that the pressure started getting to him for the first time, and it has showed because he hasn't been as otherworldly clutch as he was at the beginning of the season. And then of course not zoning like he was at the beginning of the year. You're seeing a bit of the issues with patience and how he can sometimes play a little dumb tactically. That's just growing pains, honestly. It's part of being a young player. I still am, very high on him. But I think most importantly, as far as the Coric match is concerned, that would be the return. Because Borna Coric, I think the biggest thing that stood out to me, and this was from the very first match in Cincinnati that I saw of his against Rafa, which I was in the stands for, I saw this man hitting 134s, 131s, and that continued throughout the week. Borna Coric, out of nowhere, just developed this absolute dynamo of a serve, and that was not the case pre-shoulder injury. But in Cincinnati, it was, his peak baseline level pretty much a la 2018, and then you add on this bomb of a serve. I saw his match after that one against RBA, hit 14 aces in the first set, and I was like, if this is sustainable, if this is truly the new Borna Coric, then that is absolutely someone who is going to be dangerous in pretty much any event he plays in. That being said, in spite of all that has gone down since that French Open, where I did pick him to win the title, I think that there was reason to believe that, given how unpredictable the US Open was, and this was a belief that many had, that the US Open would be the first one that Alcaraz really could realistically chase down as a top contender. I do think some people were a bit too hard on him for Wimbledon. I don't think you should have expected all that much. Fourth round wasn't a bad result at all, especially given how well Jannik Sinner played to beat him. The fact of the matter is Alcaraz is just very green on grass right now, no pun intended. But I do still have the sneaky feeling that I think hard courts are going to be his best surface. I can't prove that with stats or titles at the moment, but I just think his level has been more impressive on hard courts at its best, and I think there's some signs, I'm looking at Cincy in particular, of him returning to that top level of his. He played a couple of great matches in Cincy, particularly the one against Cilic right before the loss to Norrie, which isn't a bad loss, but if I'm being honest, it's one that he should have had up a break in the third. His level fluctuated quite a bit in that match, but still, I do feel he's in for a big US Open if he can just clear that Coric hurdle. After that, he would have maybe Evans, who's played great this hardcourt summer, and Cilic, who can be dangerous at any given moment. But I really think that Coric match will be the litmus test, and I say he'll get through it, and if he does that, I think he makes the quarters. As for who he'd meet, let's start with Jannik Sinner, the second half of what people are dubbing this rivalry between them. And I think Jannik could have had a better summer hardcourt season. Obviously, had the great result at Wimbledon and then followed that up title in Umag, beating Alcaraz in a pretty convincing match after dropping the first set. Then he had a match where he didn't really play great, but it was against a red-hot Pablo Carreño Busta in Canada, and then a match that he kind of gave away against Felix that was on his racket in Cincinnati. So I do think Jannik could have played better on the hard courts, but still, when healthy this year, he has been utterly elite pretty much, so he should be favored to make that quarterfinal, and honestly, I wouldn't argue with you if you favored him to win this whole quarter. Making round of 16 should be no big deal for him in his draw. I don't really know where Dimitrov is going to be physically, given the mounting physical ailments he's been getting over the last couple of years. I don't even know who he could play in that round of 16 because it's so hard for me to get my head around Hurkacz. You know, he's kind of a counterpuncher, but he loves the net. It's very hard to get a read on what kind of opponents he's susceptible to because, you know, this year alone you've seen the early exits in Australia and at Wimbledon where he was expected to make a deep run. Nonetheless, though, he'll be coming off a Masters 1000 final in Canada. I suppose Goffin or Musetti could take him out before then, but I don't even know, man. I don't know what's going to happen with Hubie. All I'm going to say is I do like Jannik Sinner to make the quarterfinals. And between Alcaraz and Sinner, it is totally reasonable to think that Sinner has the matchup advantage even in this limited sample size. There's things that you've seen with how Sinner just makes him so uncomfortable returning the go-to kick serve on Alcaraz's second. It oftentimes looks like Sinner forces him to press in baseline rallies just by virtue of depth and consistency, and you know, even Alcaraz is returning. He hasn't been able to break Jannik Sinner in their last two matches. So honestly, I think conventional reasoning would absolutely have Jannik Sinner winning this match, but I'm going to go against that, and I'll take Alcaraz to the semifinals. Obviously, will be a very tough match, but I really do think that a lot of those matchup things could be made easier, particularly the baseline stuff on a hard court, and I just feel like Alcaraz was playing better last I saw him, so I'm going to say Carlos finishes off his Grand Slam season with at least a semifinal appearance. And lastly, we have the bottom quarter with the Rafa Nadal quarter. Ever since this draw reveal, I think it's pretty obvious for all to see that Nadal got a pretty good draw. It is one that is so much so that I think I would call him the favorite to win this title as a result, and I will say that comes with a caveat because Nadal is so short on match play since Wimbledon. Obviously, the nature of his whole season has been starting and stopping, and as a result, he has shown that he is capable of getting himself going without that many matches. But still, lack of match play is always going to be a factor in the back of people's heads, and rightfully so. Just because he's done it before doesn't mean it's easy, not at all. But you look at this quarter and you have Nadal, Kekmanovic, Tiafoe, Schwartzman, Rublev, Shapovalov, Rune, and Norrie as the seeds. And I look at all those seeds, and honestly, from a matchup perspective, I think the most troublesome could be Shapovalov, but he's blown so hot and cold this year, and been in such a rut, albeit he did look much better in Cincinnati. But, there's still that thing where it's like, how much faith can you put in Dennis stringing together 4 consecutive wins in best of 5? But that would be worst case scenario for Rafa, considering, at this point in his career with how much his speed has eroded. Those guys who kamikaze and hit the ball so hard and have that kind of firepower, they definitely can make him panic and be difficult matchups for him. You saw it against Quarter, you saw it against Shapovalov at the beginning of this year. As far as Rafa's own trip to the quarterfinals, certainly there are some nuisances there in the past that have been sort of tricky, albeit matchups that he has a comfortable lead in against Fognini, potentially in a second round clash, and then potentially Diego Schwartzman in a fourth round clash. Both those guys struggling this year, not the same as they have been in the past, but still guys that I'm sure if you put Rafa Nadal on the net across from them, they would wake up and play inspired tennis again. That being said, in whatever limited action we saw Rafa in at Cincinnati, I don't think he played a particularly poor match. In fact, obviously the only guy who took a set off of Borna Coric throughout that week. Some rust in there for sure, but the baseline game really did come back to a level as that match progressed where it was, even by Nadal's standards, as probably the first or second best baseliner in the world right now, depending on who you ask. The biggest thing to look out for with him, I think, will be his serve. He looked like he was holding back in his one match at Cincinnati. Some hesitancy to go full throttle there, and obviously some rust on the return and stuff like that, but that will work itself out as Nadal goes further in the tournament, and I can't really see any of those guys, even the guys that have been nuisances to him, really having that much upset potential for him. Ultimately, with Diego out of form and Francis Tiafoe pretty much born to play on Ash, that guy in front of American crowds really is something to behold. It does inspire him greatly, and I think that will propel him to a second week appearance. I think he's played very well this North American summer. Had Kyrgios down match points in DC, beat Berrettini in Cincy, and I'll say he will be a sleeper to make the second week, and I think he will make the second week. I think he'll lose to Nadal. And then on the other hand, I like Cam Norrie to be the one to meet him in the quarterfinals. Cam has that monkey off his back after Wimbledon of struggles in majors. And the guy, the workhorse that he is, has just continued trudging along this summer. The guy has just been so solid, and likewise, I do feel like the biggest threat to him not making the quarters would be Denis Shapovalov catching fire. Something that I think is just very hard to count on. Andrei Rublev, albeit his last match was a very encouraging one against Taylor Fritz, hard fought, went down to the wire. It seems this summer he's lost a bit of his consistency that he seemed to have regathered earlier on in the year, and that's why I would still take Norrie over him. And ultimately, although I could see Norrie sticking around early on in a Nadal match, I don't really think he is that much of a threat to actually beat Rafa if this potential quarterfinal were to happen, and as a result, I'm pretty confident in sending Nadal through to the semifinals. And so that'll leave us with semifinals of Daniil Medvedev against Taylor Fritz, and then Rafa Nadal against Carlos Alcaraz. So starting off with Medvedev Fritz, I mentioned earlier that this was a match that happened in Cincinnati, and in my opinion, it's the match where Medvedev played the best he has this summer. Taylor played incredible for the first set and was the better player. I believe Medvedev had to save 3 or 4 set points in that opener. Serve came to the rescue on several occasions, I believe, throughout that match, and second set, Medvedev's shoulders really opened up and he played his absolute best tennis. Had one defensive get that was one for a time capsule in Daniil Medvedev's career to break early in the second. Break proved decisive, but I didn't really walk away from that match, even with Medvedev playing great, that there was that big a gap between Fritz and him, and I didn't really think that Taylor played that match all that poorly. He did many of the right things. There was a lull at the beginning of the second, and that was really the only distance that was created between them. And so in approaching a match between them potentially again at the US Open, I think it would be very competitive. With Medvedev at this point not really at that apex level that he typically is heading into the US Open, I don't really think it's a stretch to say that Fritz would have his chances to win the match even. And that's where I sort of think, in the past with how Taylor has dealt with some high leverage clutch moments, he hasn't always come through in them. I trust Medvedev a lot more mentally, and of course, this isn't to say that Fritz hasn't made massive strides there. He absolutely has this year, and, not just that, technically, his forehand improvement has totally taken him to a different level. But I do think first major semifinal in front of an American crowd would be quite the occasion, and one that, as far as nerves were concerned, could play a factor for Fritz detrimentally even. On the flip side, though, usually when your form isn't great, you're going to be found out in a Grand Slam tournament at some point, and Medvedev's draw does not help here as far as that's concerned. I saw this kind of thing at the French Open when Holger Rune upset Tsitsipas in the fourth round. But in spite of that, I think even in Medvedev's down year level-wise on these North American hard courts, I just think that even his floor level is going to be good enough. It probably won't be pretty, but honestly, I just don't see anyone that can pull it off before the final, executing that game plan of continued net approaches, hitting volleys from uncomfortable positions, and by proxy making Medvedev uncomfortable himself because of his deep return position. So I do expect it to be ugly, but I'm still going to say Medvedev makes it to the final over Fritz, probably a very tough 4 or 5 setter. And on the other hand, with that other semi, it would obviously be such a giant spectacle to have these two playing late in a slam. But that being said, if Nadal is at a semi-final, usually he will have played himself into form in the earlier rounds of the tournament. And I think ultimately what it comes down to is I think experience wins out for one more year. There are so many fluctuations in Carlos's level given the way that he plays, and I've mentioned how that can be ironed out just being a bit more patient. But for now, as things are presently constructed, best of 5 I think helps Alcaraz tremendously with being able to get away with pretty much going in and out of his best level the way that he does a lot at this point. But in a best of 5 match, those are the things I think you can't get away with against a Nadal or a Djokovic. They will jump all over those lulls. And that's really what I think would be the difference maker here. There is some matchup stuff to go by. Rafa's leftiness does help him in this matchup. But ultimately, I think that's the biggest difference maker here, and that's why I like Nadal to go through to the final in 4 sets. That sets us up with a 1 versus 2 final with Nadal and Medvedev. Saw this earlier in 2019, but I don't think it would be as competitive as that one or the Aussie Open final earlier this year. It's definitely been established at this point that Nadal has the upper hand with that matchup, with him being one of those guys that can execute and willingly does execute those, barrage of net rushes and is good enough at net to pull it off. Additionally, he's one of the last guys you want to play if your ground strokes aren't firing, and hitting through Nadal really always has been a problem for Medvedev. Rafa, of course, does tend to work him over with a lot of the variety he throws at him whenever they play too. And with Nadal, it's a completely different animal where I don't think Medvedev right now has the level to successfully pull off, wearing Nadal down just by continuing to be a wall or doing something successfully, going out of his comfort zone like he did the summer of 2019 against Djokovic and Nadal. So because of that, I am taking Rafael Nadal to win his 5th US Open and 23rd major, 3rd of this year, defeating Daniil Medvedev in the final in 4 sets. That would be quite the achievement at 36 years of age, and it just seems to me that in a field where there is a lot of uncertainty, and that exists even for Rafa, but it's a completely different mindset for him in Grand Slams, and you're going to bet on him all day over the rest of the field when it comes to rising to the occasion. And that coupled with him having what I believe is the best draw of all the top seeds, I'm going to go with Rafa. But that will do it for this video. I do hope to get another one out tomorrow before the tournament starts. Of course, amped to watch the US Open kick off again for another fortnight. It is my personal favorite of the majors, so can't wait to get underway. And I'll probably see y'all again very soon during the early stages of the tournament. But real quick before we wrap up, if you made it this far and enjoyed the video, it would be much appreciated if you could hit the like button. Helps this video perform much better in YouTube's algorithm. And subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Thank you all again so much for watching, and of course I will see y'all in the next one.